Hey guys, this is Kendall Terry, and today we're going to be looking at the evolution of species, part 1. The question comes up of, obviously to start us off, we're going to talk about the evolution of species. We have to know what a species is. So here we're told that a species is an organism that can reproduce fertile offspring in nature. Now there are some organisms that we know because of what we've done in zoos and in labs can reproduce fertile offspring. But what we're looking at are the ones that can produce fertile offspring in nature, meaning on their own, under normal circumstances. And there are some things that keep that from happening, and those are called barriers. Barriers prevent organisms from breeding outside of their species. And we're going to talk about two types of barriers. The first is called a pre-zygotic barrier, and those are the barriers that impede mating between species or hinder fertilization. I've got a little diagram here. It's the sperm cannot unite with the egg. So this is before any zygote, thus pre-zygotic, is ever formed. And we'll talk about some different types of these in just a minute. The next type of barrier is called a post-zygotic barrier, and these are preventions of the hybrid zygote from developing into viable or fertile offspring or adults. So we have the sperm is uniting with the egg, but the zygote is either discarded or develops into an adult, but that adult is sterile, or it develops into adult, but the next generation is what we call breaks down. And we'll talk about all three of those in more detail. So when we look at some pre-zygotic barriers, the first we're going to look at is called habitat isolation. And these are two species live in different habitats, they call two different places homes, to where they're not going to come in contact with each other. So they may be able to interbreed, and they may even be able to interbreed fertile offspring, but because of the place they live or their habitat, they don't ever come in contact with each other. For instance, we see this with several different species of reptiles and snakes and stuff, but here we've got a snake and we've got two different species of snakes that technically, probably, if they actually encountered each other in the right time, would be able to reproduce. But this one is one that is primarily living in land. Obviously the grass there for you. This one is primarily living in water. So because they have different habitats, they don't come in contact with each other enough to actually reproduce fertile offspring, and because of that separation, they're different species. The next is called behavioral isolation, and these are special signals that attract mates, as well as elaborate behavior unique to the species. An obvious example of this is the peacock tail feathers. If you've ever seen a peacock male, those huge tail feathers that can stick up, those are an attraction point for the female. So a female is not going to pick a male that doesn't have that in natural circumstances. You can see this with several species. The blue feet of the blue-footed boobies, that bird and the dance that it does to attract that mate. Well, if you don't have those blue feet, if you don't have that dance, you're not going to be picked to mate with. So those are behaviors that isolate species. If you don't have the right stuff, then that species is not going to give you the time of day during reproduction. The next is a temporal isolation. Temporal meaning time. So two species that breed during different times of the day, or different seasons, or different years. And that way then their gametes do not mix. And there's a lot of examples of this with flowers, where technically the pollen could fertilize the egg. But because the flowers are open at different times of the day, or they're open at slightly different times of the month for a particular season, or different times of the year or whatever, if those flowers aren't open at the right times, then they're not going to be fertilized by those pollinators. So that's a temporal isolation. The next two pre-zygotic barriers, the last two, are mechanical isolation, and this is species attempt to mate, but they fail to consummate the act because they are anatomically incomplete. We see this as an example with a lot of copulatory organs in nature. I like to think back to that O.J. Simpson trial of, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Well, same thing here. If the parts don't go together, then reproduction can't take place. So that's this is primarily looking at the ones that do internal fertilization, because the parts are having to actually fit together. The next one deals with a lot of organisms that do external fertilization, but can also apply to internal, and that is gametic isolation. And this is gamete recognition, maybe based on the presence of specific molecules on the coats around the egg, or the sperm cannot survive in the female internal environment. So a lot of these are external, where you'll have the female lay eggs and then the male come along and lay and deposit sperm all over the eggs. Well, in a natural environment, you may have more than one species that has laid eggs in that area. But if the sperm goes to that egg and it doesn't have the right attachment points, doesn't have the right proteins, then it's not going to be able to reproduce. It's not going to actually develop. The sperm may also in internal structures be deposited, but if the female internal environment is not an environment that sperm can survive in, then obviously that sperm does not ever fertilize the egg. So now we've got the three post-zygotic barriers. In these you have reduced hybrid viability, and this is the genetic incompatibility between the two species may cause the abortion of the developing zygote at some stage. So that's just a natural process of aborting that embryo. So there has been sperm and egg come together, but some point during that development, before that organism's born, the body or the female environment or whatever will kick that egg out, abort it, stop the reproduction or stop the development of it, whatever may be the case. The next is reduced hybrid fertility. These are the hybrids are completely or largely sterile. The most common example of this is mules, the cross between donkey and horse. Those mules on average then aren't able to reproduce with either the donkey or the horse or other mules. So they're completely sterile, or at least largely so. The last one is called hybrid breakdown, and this one's kind of hard to understand sometimes, but it's one that you're actually more familiar with than what you realize. And this is the first generation hybrids are viable and fertile, and everything looks great. But the offspring of the next generation are feeble or sterile. And the reason why I said you're most familiar with this one is because a lot of the modern vegetables that you eat are hybrids. So that if you took that vegetable and tried to plant it out in a field, you might actually grow something that first generation, but the next generation that you try to use of that is not going to actually reproduce anything. Sometimes it's the generation that you're eating is that first generation, and if you try to grow those, that next generation is feeble or sterile, can't reproduce anything, can't do anything with it. So, and this is one of the scary parts of a lot of our modern vegetables is that you have to have the non-hybrid ones to actually be able to produce a crop year after year after year, and that is not what's produced for mass consumption many times in our current circumstances. The last two slides today deal with modes of speciation. How are species formed? And that's what speciation means, the formation of a new species. How does that happen? Well, there's two main causes of that. The first is called allopatric speciation. In allopatric speciation, you have, for instance, this field of trees. That's my best example I can do of a tree. You have this field of trees, and then some type of event has taken place where you get some kind of river or island breaks off or mountain range comes up or whatever, where there is some kind of divide that takes place between those two populations now. It was one population, there's been a divide, now there's two different populations. If this divide is severe enough to where these populations can no longer interbreed with each other, sometimes you will get a new species to develop. In this case, I went with the same population here. Those stayed the same. But you've got a new trait that develops based on this new environment, whatever that may be. It may be on the opposite side now of a mountain and not get the right amount of rainfall anymore, so it's had to survive and adapt to maybe a different rainfall. It could be on a different side of the river where you're dealing with a different animal for pollination now. Whatever may be the case, there's been a change, and if that change is severe enough that these can no longer reproduce with each other, then we would start calling these a new species. And that's through geographic isolation, a river, an island, a mountain range, things like that. The other is called sympatric speciation, and we're actually going to deal with this one on the next slide as well. But you have a population, once again, of trees, and then through some kind of genetic mutation or hybrid situation, we'll look at some examples, you get a different type of tree all of a sudden start to develop that has different characteristics that maybe through that mutation or through that hybrid situation is no longer able to reproduce with the original species, and at that point then you have a new species that's developed. This happens most often with plants. You don't see this really in the animal kingdom too much to this degree. Small population becomes a new species without geographic isolation. There was nothing that separated them there, but there was some type of mutation that caused that to happen. On the last slide here, we're looking at sympatric speciation some more. There's two examples that cause sympatric speciation. There's autopolyploidy and there's allopolyploidy. So let's look at the difference between the two. In autopolyploidy, you have the original species that produce gametes that are unreduced, meaning that something messed up during meiosis to where these should only have 2 chromosomes, but instead they have 4. And if they're able to self-fertilize, meaning reproduce with themselves, which many plant species are able to do that, they will produce a new zygote. And this zygote will have double the amount of chromosomes that the original parent did. So this zygote may not be able to reproduce with this parent species anymore, but if it's able to self-fertilize, it won't need another species to reproduce with. It'll be able to reproduce on its own, and eventually you'll get enough of these around that this will be a strong population as well. So if the zygote is offspring with polyploidy karyotype, meaning it's got more than the normal chromosome that it should have, may be viable, meaning able to survive, and self-fertile, meaning it can fertilize its own offspring. It doesn't need another organism to help it do that. In allopolyploidy, you deal with this species with 4 chromosomes and this species down here with 6. This species has a unreduced gamete, so it should only have 2 chromosomes in its gamete, but for whatever reason it has 4. This one goes through a normal gamete cycle and produces 3 chromosomes. For whatever reason, these two come together. That could just be purely by chance. They come together, they produce this organism here that has 7 chromosomes. This organism with 7 chromosomes produces a gamete that is unreduced, so another mutation has taken place. Unreduced gamete. This original one here, you could say species B over here, has a gamete, a normal gamete that is able to combine with this unreduced one, and you end up with a fertile, viable offspring that now has 10 chromosomes, when the original 2, this one had 4 and this one had 6, so neither one of these may be able to reproduce with this one anymore. This one may be able to self-fertilize. It may be able to have, maybe this has happened more than once, so there's more than one of these to reproduce with each other. Whatever may be the case, this will also produce a new species. This happens more often, autopolyploidy, than this one, allopolyploidy. But both of these we're dealing with primarily plants. Plants are able to handle these types of mutations better than animal species, and even looking at like protists and fungi and things like that. We just don't handle the genetic mutations the way plants can.